My name is Courtney Miller. I'm a software engineering PhD candidate in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you to the Allen School Faculty Search Committee for the opportunity to share my work. I'm excited to talk to you about my research on navigating sociotechnical disruptions in software engineering. To start us off, I'm going to show some examples of the disruptions I've studied. XCUtils is a core compression library used by major Linux distributions, and in 2024, a backdoor built into the code base using a social engineering attack was days away from being released to millions of systems. It was caught by a single developer, preventing catastrophe. Nonetheless, the incident was a major disruption to supply chains globally, increasing widespread concerns about this critical security risk. But not all disruptions make the news. In fact, the abandonment of open source packages rarely makes headlines. Nonetheless, from my own work and that of others, we know that abandonment can disrupt supply chain integrity for millions of downstream users, creating unanticipated risks that many struggle to deal with. Toxicity can disrupt open source communities by creating hostile environments that can lead to contributor disengagement. For example, Brian Hughes, a former member of Node.js leadership, recounted his experience with toxicity in the community, which slowly bore down at his morale until he decided to step away. And more recently, the adoption of GenAI tools has created a significant disruption to many established software development practices. Now, the four examples I've just described might seem very different, but they have a key commonality. They're all examples of disruptions in software engineering. In other words, critical junctures where established software development and maintenance practices collide with unanticipated socio-technical change, requiring the re-engineering of tools, practices, and workflows. My research focuses on helping developers navigate these disruptions. I study the intersection of technical capabilities and human practices that determine successful transitions during periods of socio-technical disruption. In order to accomplish this, I use a three-step methodological approach where I go the full mile of exploring, measuring, and improving how developers navigate these disruptions. By leveraging my 8 years of empirical research experience and my degree in statistics, I develop empirical mixed method protocols with interdisciplinary theoretical grounding, blending human-centered qualitative techniques with large-scale data-driven analysis, modeling, and visualization. To give a glimpse of the methods I've used, to explore, for example, I've used paired interview analysis and theoretical framework development. To measure, I've used large-scale repository mining and trace data analysis and Kaplan-Meier survival analysis. And to improve, I've used iterative heuristic development and operationalization, as well as theory-driven RAG-based LLM tool development. I've studied different disruptions, but for most of this talk, I'll be focused on the disruption I spent the majority of my dissertation working on, dependency abandonment. Then I'll briefly cover a more recent disruption I've studied, GenAI adoption. And finally, I'll share some of my current and future research vision for studying the disruptions of tomorrow. So let's get started with abandonment. Open source software is the digital equivalent of the roads and bridges that we rely on to get from point A to point B. It also serves as the foundation for the software supply chains that our modern digital society runs on. However, despite our widespread reliance, the reliability and continued maintenance is no sure thing, with most creation and maintenance effort coming from volunteers for many of these projects. And when an open source package is abandoned, it shifts from a free software artifact to a costly liability, which can create supply chain disruptions, exposing users to the risks of unpatched vulnerabilities, targeted supply chain attacks, and costly unplanned migrations. This discrepancy between the expectations placed on and the reality of open source has motivated the need to study and improve open source sustainability. However, thus far, most open source sustainability research has primarily focused on trying to prevent abandonment disruptions from happening by trying to keep particular projects and ecosystems alive and maintained. However, my work intentionally takes a different tack. I help users adapt to and navigate abandonment disruptions when they occur by shifting the focus to the user perspective and considering the risks and realities they face in today's digital landscape. In order to actualize this, I leverage my three-step methodological approach to explore, measure, and improve abandonment disruptions. So let's get started by exploring them. We started by conducting semi-structured exploratory interviews with 33 developers who had faced dependency abandonment, where we spoke to them about their concrete past experiences. We analyzed the interview data using iterative thematic analysis, and we performed a validity check with interviewees. A key finding I want to highlight is that identifying abandonment in the first place often required time and effort-intensive manual investigations, such as by examining package repository characteristics that users judged to be signals of activity, such as the last time an issue was closed or a commit was made, creating a bottleneck in the process of dealing with abandonment disruptions and making it very difficult to do so at scale. Therefore, we hypothesize, following from signaling theory, that increasing information transparency surrounding abandonment disruptions can make them more visible and in turn support downstream responses. So, through our first step of exploring and talking to people, we now have a much better understanding and lots of anecdotal evidence. But to inform intervention design, we want to now measure how prevalent it is. So we next perform a large-scale quantitative statistical analysis of widely used package abandonment in the NPM ecosystem. But before we could identify abandoned packages, we had to first define and operationalize the concept of package abandonment, which was a non-trivial challenge. But we ended up coming up with two heuristics. First, explicit notice abandonment, where the maintainers of a package express their intention publicly to no longer maintain it, such as by putting a note in the top of the README or flagging the repo as archived. Then we have activity-based abandonment, which is where there's a clear shift in the activity patterns of a package from regular maintenance to an extended period of inactivity. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the methods, but I'll give some highlights. We started by analyzing metadata for all packages in the NPM ecosystem as of January of 2015 to identify the subset that were widely used, which we define as packages with at least 10,000 downloads in at least 1 month during our longitudinal observation window, which spanned from January of 2015 to December of 2020. Once we identified the widely used packages, we used our two heuristics of abandonment to identify the subset that experienced abandonment during that window. We also generated a sample of widely used packages with normal update releases and vulnerability patch releases so that we can use them as a baseline comparison when contextualizing the response to abandonment. We then identified exposed downstream users and then performed different forms of statistical analysis, including a Kaplan-Meier survival curve to compare and contextualize the response to abandonment with other practices, logistic regression analysis, looking at the relationship between downstream project characteristics and likelihood of removal, and finally, to evaluate our hypothesis surrounding the impact of supporting downstream responses with information transparency, we built a Cox proportional hazards survival model. In terms of our key results, we found that abandonment is common, even among highly downloaded projects, with roughly 15% of widely used packages being abandoned during our 6-year observation window. Now, in terms of downstream response, this is a Kaplan-Meier survival curve showing the probability of dependency abandonment not being resolved over time by surviving downstream users. By adding in our baseline comparisons, we can see that security patches are updated at higher rates and faster than other updates, and that developers tend to react to abandonment at similar rates and with similar latency, generally speaking, as they do to standard dependency updates. So what we're seeing is that this is an issue that people are struggling with, similar to other forms of dependency management like updates. Now, for what is, in my opinion, the most important finding of this study, providing explicit notice of package abandonment increases the likelihood of downstream project removal by 58%, holding all other covariates constant, demonstrating that increasing information transparency can encourage and support more timely responses. This is a positive sign because it indicates that this disconnect is at least in part due to a lack of awareness, which we can support through tooling to help improve the automated identification of abandonment, which we will get right into next. So we take these insights from our measurement step and we use them to inform the design of a prototype tool to help improve the processes used by developers to help identify abandonment. Because we already know that many developers don't care about all dependency abandonment equally, and we don't want to overwhelm them with notifications they don't care about, we set out to develop a prototype tool with intelligent pre-configuration that predicts which dependencies abandonment will be disruptive to a user given the context of their dependency usage. We started by extracting expert knowledge through need-finding interviews and developing our theoretical framework. Then we operationalized and extracted a body of relevant theory-driven context, developed our theory-driven structured reasoning prompt, built our classifier, and then performed an independent user study to evaluate the classifier's performance. For the sake of time, I'm not going to get into the results of this study, but I will say that they demonstrate that our classifier is effective at predicting developers' judgments of abandonment impacts. The survey also got positive feedback in the open response questions, with many developers saying that the intelligent pre-configuration direction seemed promising and like something they would be excited to see in their tooling in the future. So far, we've been focused on abandonment disruptions, which show how small routine disruptions can derail teams without proper visibility and guidance. But not all disruptions are small. So let me show you what happens when the tools themselves change. Probably the biggest disruption developers, at least most of them, face today is GenAI. They fundamentally disrupt existing software development processes. However, despite widespread availability, adoption remains uneven even among teams, undercutting expected productivity gains, frustrating management expectations, and casting uncertainty on the future role of developers. Therefore, during my recent internship at Microsoft Research, I led a study exploring why adoption varies among developers in similar contexts. Now, connecting back to my methodological approach, if we map it onto the current disruption of GenAI adoption, we are in the explore stage right now. So, to understand why adoption varies among developers in seemingly similar contexts, we spoke to pairs of developers from the same team matched on key characteristics who had contrasting usage patterns, so that we could directly compare the context-specific barriers faced by an infrequent user with the context-specific workarounds leveraged by their frequent user counterpart. More specifically, we interviewed 54 developers representing 27 matched pairs. Each pair was from the same team and then further matched on primary programming language, seniority, and role, ensuring same team-level context, including codebase manager and team policies. The pairs were identified using GitHub Copilot telemetry data. The interview data was analyzed using iterative thematic analysis, and we did perform a validity check with interviewees as well. A key finding I want to highlight is that we learned that sufficient time was crucial for initial adoption and advanced skill development. However, many developers, both frequent and infrequent users, reported facing increased productivity expectations from management simply due to having tool access, which often directly translated into tighter deadlines, which made many revert to their known, tried and true methods to get things done and out the door quickly, in turn limiting the necessary tool use and exploration that would lead to the proficiency and potentially the expected productivity gains. Now, we refer to this self-perpetuating organizational dynamic as the productivity pressure paradox, where increased productivity expectations from management without corresponding support creates a paradoxical effect where developers lack the time necessary to develop the skills that would save time. Now, let's get into the final chapter of future work. To take a step back, across my research, I help developers navigate disruptions. Using my methodological approach, I go the full mile, and moving forward, there's many disruptions I want to study. For each, I will leverage my approach. But it's worth noting that for each new disruption I study, I'm not starting from scratch. Each disruption I study builds my experience in how to study and support developers through disruptions. For example, what methods reveal the challenges, how to study different types of patterns and phenomena at scale effectively, what interventions actually land. That accumulated knowledge makes me more effective at tackling the next one. Let me show you some examples of the topics and disruptions my future work will examine. AI-enabled supply chain attack resilience, organizational GenAI adoption, GenAI coding and review practices, the evolution of roles on dev teams due to GenAI adoption, and finally, some of the unanticipated disruptions of tomorrow. Now, for the sake of time in this talk, I will focus on my first future work thrust, AI-enabled supply chain attack resilience. The exponential growth in supply chain attacks has been disruptive to software security in recent years, and my work will help develop AI-powered tools and strategies that enable proactive adaptation and resilience rather than reactive crisis management. For example, following the success of leveraging our theory-driven reasoning and context plus LLM approach to identify context-specific impactful abandonment, I will explore how we can leverage that same approach to create tooling for other supply chain security-related tasks like vulnerability triage prioritization, ecosystem risk forecasting, and dependency migration planning. We also learned that identifying abandonment isn't enough and that many developers require guidance on next steps. So I will also measure the effectiveness of using project-specific abandonment response blueprints at supporting downstream responses. Using participatory design and controlled user trials, I will develop LLM-based tools for synthesizing community insights and project-specific analysis. In summary, my work focuses on helping developers navigate various timely disruptions. It's been recognized through 3 ACM Distinguished Paper Awards and a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. I use my 3-step approach to go the whole mile of exploring, measuring, and improving how they navigate these disruptions. And in the future, I will leverage my approach to help study the disruptions of tomorrow. This has been a condensed look at my research. I'd love the opportunity to share more about these projects, including the future directions I'm most excited about, in a full conversation. Thank you for your time and consideration.